Hello and welcome to Psychoanalysis Tube. In this video I'm going to talk about the first lecture of the famous Introductory Lectures on Psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud, which were published in German between 1916 and 1917. As you may know, in total there are 35 lectures, if you also consider the new Introductory Lectures on Psychoanalysis, which were published much later in 1933. Interestingly, while Freud gave the introductory lectures at the University of Vienna during World War I, the new introductory lectures were actually never lectured at all, as such appearing only in written form. Freud simply felt the need to revise and extend his previous effort at an introduction, according to developments that came after 1916-17 in the world of psychoanalysis. So my first project for this new channel is to make one video for each of the 35 lectures, so stay tuned if you are interested in this little adventure. But before I move on, let me give some last remarks for the sake of an overview. So here you can see all the existing lectures which lie ahead of us. We start with part 1 on the parapraxis. The second part is concerned with dreams, which will lead us up to chapter 15. Then, concluding the 1916-17 lectures, we will eventually come to the third part, which is fairly broad thematically speaking. Freud labeled it General Theory of the Neuroses. At last, these are the names of the 1933 lectures, which are not grouped into superordinate parts. So let's end with the overview and start with the first lecture, which functions as an introduction. Freud warns us that he will treat us as though we knew nothing at all about psychoanalysis, other than knowing that psychoanalysis is a medical treatment for neurotic patients. Additionally, I think that Freud treats us very much as though he perceived himself as gazed upon by a rather medically oriented audience, to which he then should reply. Indeed, right from the start, Freud immediately feels the need to point out some preliminary differences between how medical doctors deal with patients, or at least how they dealt with patients at his day and age, and how psychoanalysts deal with patients, which is quite different. So essentially, at its core, what Freud does in this chapter is to elucidate his opinion on the following question. Which difficulties does one encounter when first confronted with psychoanalysis? Or, formulated differently, here this is basically to ask, what stands in the way of becoming a friend of psychoanalysis? Freud suggests that the difficulty is not limited to a general distrust and hostility that lurked against psychoanalysis within society at Freud's time, as is well known. Although Freud does indeed point to this hostility and even warns the audience against getting into psychoanalysis, effectively calling such a move a career killer. Freud invites us to think furtherly about the difficulties one can encounter. Which habits of thought contribute to making us into opponents of psychoanalysis? What must be overcome in and by us in order to defeat an almost intuitive opposition to psychoanalysis? I believe that these difficulties can be organized into 3 different, although partly overlapping types. The first type of difficulty is connected to instruction and training in psychoanalysis. It's connected to problems of knowledge acquisition in the domain of psychoanalysis, as such being a quite epistemological problem. Freud points to the fact that in medical training, students are habituated to see things. Students see anatomical preparations, chemical reactions, they can see how muscles contract in response to nerve stimulation, and so on. Also in neurology and psychiatry, it was not uncommon to make case demonstrations, as can be seen on this famous painting of Charcot, delivering a lecture and demonstrating a patient at the Salpêtrière. So, forming a judgment upon a specific topic along these lines is usually not especially controversial among students. In a way, one could say that seeing is believing. However, in psychoanalysis, Freud insists, everything is quite different. Importantly, this is because if you strip down the analytic encounter to its core, it is nothing else than an interchange of words between the analyst and the analysand. As Anna O., also known as Bertha Pappenheim, suggested, it's essentially a talking cure. The analysand associates freely, talks about the past and about present feelings, discontents, desires, and so on. But these are just words. How could mere talking affect the illness at all? These are perplexities often heard, for example, by the relatives of the patient in question. Here, Freud points to the short-sightedness of these thoughts. Firstly, this skeptical stance almost appears comical when one considers that it is often held by the same persons, thinking that patients are just imagining their symptoms. But more substantially, it is a short-sighted stance when one acknowledges that human beings are essentially social and linguistic beings in language. Words can make you enthusiastically happy, hate speech can drive you into misery, so far as to even consider ending your life. Words can convey knowledge, can move masses, can provoke wars, or as the British philosopher of language J.L. Austin said, words can do things in the world. To doubt the effect of words upon human suffering is short-sighted, because it seems evident, on a second thought, that mere words yield an almost magical power on us. So the student could say, okay, I may not see anything in psychoanalysis quite like I would in other medical disciplines, but at least I can hear the words uttered between analyst and patient and form my idea of psychoanalysis thereupon. But Freud, interestingly, states that we cannot do that either. He maintains that the psychoanalytic situation allows for no listener, as the patient is only able to open up to a degree required by analysis if she or he has a special emotional attachment to the analyst. This seems to be an issue that can at least be problematized, as many training institutions do indeed practice observation of the therapeutic setting in one form or the other. However, it does seem fair and plausible that the analysand is facilitated in the task of opening up under the condition of a functional attachment to the analyst. Summing up this point, Freud maintains here that one can neither learn psychoanalysis by directly seeing nor by directly listening as an external observer in the analytic treatment situation. As such, one starts to learn about psychoanalysis simply by hearing about it from someone else, from hearsay. This puts us in a difficult situation to form a judgment about psychoanalysis, as our judgment will obviously depend on the extent that we will endow our source, in this case Freud, with epistemic trust. These are quite hostile epistemological conditions, as it can be immediately recognized that this situation shares quite some proximities with informal fallacies, like the appeal to authority. Freud said it, so it must be true. So at first it seems that Freud is quite undermining himself here. However, I think what Freud actually tries to do here is to make us think. Is this a peculiarity of psychoanalysis? Isn't some degree of trust perhaps even necessary within collective enterprises like science for functions like the transmission of knowledge to be successful? Freud tries an analogy to history. Let's imagine for a moment that we are attending a lecture about Alexander the Great. On what grounds would we believe the lecturer, the historian? Isn't her or his epistemic position even more unfavorable than Freud's as a psychoanalyst? For the historian wasn't even there when Alexander waged his wars. Freud at least can proud himself of being he himself there in the analytical situation, listening carefully to the patient. So how come we believe the historian? Why aren't we, or at least most of us, doubting the reality of Alexander the Great? Shouldn't we be more skeptical of his existence? Maybe we believe because the historian can point us to various reports of ancient authors, maybe contemporaries of Alexander the Great, writing about him, witnessing his existence. But strictly speaking, Freud points out, this only proves that earlier generations already believed in Alexander's existence. Hence, we could start a skeptical criticism from anew. So, in a way, what Freud tries to do with this analogy, in my opinion, is to increase our sensibility for the complexity of epistemic trust. Only few of us will completely deny the existence of Alexander the Great, because there is no definite and unshakable proof of his existence. Rather, our judgment will probably be more complex. Perhaps our informed opinion about Alexander will involve our belief that some parts of reported history are more deserving of credence than other details. This implies that epistemic trust is a complex attribution influenced by various contextual considerations, like, do we believe the historian has a motive for lying about existence of something? How similar is the historian's report to other sources that are already deemed by the majority to be reliable, and so on. Freud is not saying to simply believe him. Rather, he tries to make us think about a first difficulty that we encounter when we hear about psychoanalysis, a difficulty in our first impact, so to speak. This difficulty being that our judgment about psychoanalysis will necessarily be influenced by our trust in the source in a way that is more reminiscent and comparable to history than it is to medicine. However, Freud does concede that we have the right to ask the question: how do we then, after all, learn about psychoanalysis properly if we are serious about it? If we really want to learn about it and not just from hearsay, how to proceed if we want to go beyond this first impact? And here, I think, Freud wants psychoanalysis to depart from the analogy of history. Freud insists that one can learn psychoanalysis best when one actually undergoes it within what is now called a training analysis. Although it was only in 1922 that the IPA formalized the principle of an obligatory training analysis for the purpose of psychoanalytic education, Freud already stresses here that the phenomena described by psychoanalysis in theory should be experienced firsthand in one's own training analysis, and that this is the best way to really learn psychoanalysis. Freud hence proceeds to the second type of difficulty that we might face when we are first confronted with psychoanalysis. This difficulty is more ontological in nature. It has to do with a certain way of thinking that is, or at least was, typical of medicine. Freud writes, addressing students of medicine, "You have been trained to find an anatomical basis for the functions of the organism and their disorders, to explain them chemically and physically, and to view them biologically. But no portion of your interest has been directed to psychical life, in which, after all, the achievement of this marvelously complex organism reaches its peak. For that reason, psychological modes of thought have remained foreign to you." Freud goes further, asserting that these psychological modes of thought are not only foreign to the medical student, but that the medical students have been trained to look at these modes with suspicion, to deny them the possibility of being scientific, to leave everything connected to psychology to laypersons, poets, philosophers, esoteric gurus, and so on. Freud perceives this to be a limitation not only in theory, but also in quite practical terms, and indeed it seems well known today that the therapeutic effect of many medical interventions can be influenced by all kinds of psychological effects, like expectancy effects. As such, excluding psychological modes of thought is not only theoretically questionable, but also highly impractical. In summary of this point, what Freud suggests is that psychoanalysis will be judged unfavorably by medical students because of the ontological prejudices that reign or reigned in medicine. This is because psychoanalysis is a discipline that tries to operate entirely with psychological hypotheses. Freud finally comes to the third and last type of difficulty that he mentions in this chapter, a difficulty that doesn't only apply to medical students or professionals, but to everyone. This is because, as Freud puts it, two of the hypotheses of psychoanalysis are an insult to the entire world and have earned its dislike. So let's give a look at these two hypotheses. The first unpopular hypothesis that molds us to become an opponent of psychoanalysis is the hypothesis of the unconscious. Psychoanalysis asserts that mental processes are in themselves unconscious, and that the property of consciousness is given only to a subset of mental products. While it seems to me that this hypothesis is probably much less scandalous now in comparison to how it was received at Freud's time, it still carries much controversy with it today. Many persons are in the habit of identifying the mental with the conscious. As such, defining the mental as something that by necessity is conscious. To them, saying that the mental processes can also be unconscious sounds like a contradiction in terms. Or, at best, it's seen by them as an open declaration to esotericism. Freud, however, stresses that psychoanalysis cannot accept consciousness as a definitional characteristic of the mental. Rather, he defines the mental as consisting of processes such as feeling, thinking, and willing, and from here, psychoanalysis has taught us that there is unconscious thinking and that there is willing that remains unknown to the one who wills. Freud insists that the psychoanalytic hypothesis of the unconscious is empirically founded and that it is revolutionary for how we look at ourselves and the world. Defending the thesis that the unconscious exists is not to be confused for Freud with an empty dispute about the definition of the mental. This book, as a whole, should then function as an introduction that potentially consolidates this Freudian claim about unconscious thought and will. The second, not unconnected hypothesis that has warranted the disdain of many opponents of psychoanalysis is the claim that sexual drives are of exceptional importance for the causation of neurosis and other mental disorders. But not only, they are also profoundly involved in contributing to humans' highest cultural, social and artistic creations. While the sexual drives will be the topic of the 20th lecture, it is already graspable that they play a quite overarchingly crucial role in Freud's theory. Let me give a side note on the topic of translation. It is well known that James Strachey, who started to translate Freud's work into English from 1924 onward, consistently translated the Freudian Trieb into the English word instinct. That's why, if you read the English translation of this chapter, you will not find any mention of sexual drives, but rather you will hear about sexual instincts. And although this translation had its reasons, which can be read in the general preface of Strachey's The Standard Edition of the Complete Psychological Works of Sigmund Freud, starting with page Roman 23, I prefer the not uncommon reading that translates Trieb with drive. Additionally, not so much on translation, but generally on Freud's use of words, Freud uses the word sexual but immediately adds to this, and I think this is of utmost importance, sexual in the narrower and wider sense of the word. This is because in psychoanalysis the word sexual does not only denote genital intercourse, but rather it stands for much more than that, as one can clearly understand when reading, for example, the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. But now let's go back to our introductory chapter. Freud establishes that in his experience the aversion to psychoanalysis is strongly determined by a resistance against this outcome of psychoanalytic research, so resistance to seeing sexual drives as so ubiquitous and important in human life. Freud then points the audience to a preliminary hint at his explanation for this resistance. Let's give a look to a longer section where Freud talks about this. Freud writes, "We believe that civilization has been created under the pressure of the exigencies of life at the cost of satisfaction of the drives. And we believe that civilization is to a large extent being constantly created anew, since each individual who makes a fresh entry into human society repeats the sacrifice of drive satisfaction for the benefit of the whole community. Among the drives which are put to this use, the sexual drives play an important part. In this process they are sublimated. That is to say, they are diverted from their sexual aims and directed to others that are socially higher and no longer sexual. But this arrangement is unstable. The sexual drives are imperfectly tamed, and in the case of every individual who is supposed to join the work of civilization, there is a risk that her or his sexual drives may refuse to be put to that use. Society believes that no greater threat to its civilization could arise than if the sexual drives were to be liberated and returned to their original aims. For this reason, society does not wish to be reminded of this precarious portion of its foundations. Now it is inherent in human nature to have an inclination to consider a thing untrue if one does not like it, and after that it is easy to find arguments against it. Thus, society makes what is disagreeable into what is untrue. So let's comment to this longer quote a bit, also in reference to another very similar quote, which can be found on page 311 in lecture 20. Freud thinks that civilization rests on the foundation that there are not enough provisions to nourish its members, unless the members work. As such, civilization must ensure that its members, or the vast majority of its members, deflect energy from sexuality, which in its reproductive ability would cause even more members in need of nourishment, and instead redirect their energy to work, which in this case can be an instance of sublimation. So Freud envisions that civilization founds on the fact that everyone wants to satisfy their drive wishes, but that the means of satisfaction are scarce, because of an external hardship dictated by reality. The required consequence, then, is that humans renounce a big chunk of drive satisfaction. Freud goes on to say that this phylogenetic speculation is meaningfully connected to ontogenesis, which is to say that there is some connection between the history of humankind itself and the individual history of each person from infant to adulthood. This connection between phylogenesis and ontogenesis is a theme that pops up again and again when reading Freud. In this reading, inasmuch as Freud stresses that each child has to repeat the same drive sacrifice in order to become a member of civilization. Note also that this assertion, in a way, also contains the notion that children have some sort of sexuality, which is not unimportant given how much scandal Freud's ideas on infantile sexuality caused among academics and the public. Finally, Freud argues that, as an effect of this sacrifice of drive satisfaction, the anonymous personified society fears one thing the most, that the sexual drives regain sexual aims. Freud argues here that it is for this reason that society tries to divert attention from the importance of sexuality, and that this in turn makes us, as members in and of society, remarkably prone to disregard psychoanalysis. So, that is all for this first introductory lecture of Freud. Here you can see a last summarized overview of all the difficulties which Freud thinks that we could encounter when first confronted with psychoanalysis. First, the difficulty with instruction and training in psychoanalysis. Second, the difficulty with prejudices against the psychological modes of thought. And third, the difficulties generated because psychoanalysis is in some sense insulting to the entire world, under which fall the assumption of the unconscious and the stressing of sexuality. Freud finishes this lecture inviting us to make an effort in overcoming these difficulties. In the next lecture, Freud will begin with his elucidation of the parapraxis, also known to us as Freudian slips. If you like this video and you would like to see more content of this kind, please consider liking the video and subscribing to Psychoanalysis Tube. Thank you for watching.